My Nerd World.
And welcome to it. It is My Nerd World. I'm your host, John Justice. And welcome to this spoiler-filled review of the latest addition to the Alien franchise, Alien Romulus. As always, if you want to email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. If you happen to be enjoying this show on YouTube, you can go and leave a comment there, and typically I go and share the emails and listener feedback on subsequent shows. Normally you find the Star Wars podcast here on this channel as well, but I like to come on and share with you my thoughts of other films, science fiction films most specifically. I'm a huge fan of the Alien franchise. Much like Star Wars, seeing that with my father when I was 5 years old. My dad introduced me to Blade Runner in the theaters. I'm fairly certain he also introduced me to Alien, not in the movie theater, unless we'd gone to see it on a re-release, because certainly I would have been too young when it originally came out to see this film. But it, like the other films I mentioned, had a huge impact on my love of science fiction, genre films, and franchises. Alien and the Alien franchise is up there with those other franchises that I love. Again, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Matrix, the Avatar franchise now that's turned into. But Alien and the entire franchise are films that I very much enjoy. I love the first two, Alien and Aliens. The director's cut of Alien 3, I think, is very good. The shorter version they released in theaters wasn't great, but when they salvaged together the parts that the studio had cut out from David Fincher's foray into the Alien franchise, I quite enjoy the director's cut of that. I was disappointed, even though I enjoyed the movie, and there's certain aspects of Alien Resurrection, specifically the ending, that I didn't care for as much. That's kind of been remedied with Alien Romulus. And I'll add that I really do love Ridley Scott's prequels of Prometheus and Covenant. And one of the things that Alien Romulus does, in my opinion, is it brings in all of the mythology to a brand new film that takes place between Alien and Aliens, which I'm hoping is going to be the next step in future Alien movies, because this film does something rather unique and pulls off something that typically doesn't usually work, especially among popular franchises like this one is. So, before I get into all that, what I decided I would do is I'll go ahead and basically break down the film for the most part, and then share with you the things that I love about the movie and a few things that I didn't care for nearly as much. This entry into the Alien franchise is directed by Fede Alvarez of Don't Breathe. I believe he did 1 and 2 and Evil Dead, the most recent version of that. I've seen the older versions of that film. I did not see either of the Don't Breathe movies or Evil Dead, so I'm completely unfamiliar with his work as a director. Needless to say, with what he's done with Alien Romulus, I'm a fan of his now, and those are films, maybe not Evil Dead, that's a little bit too intense for me, but perhaps Don't Breathe will be films that I'll be checking out in the future. As I mentioned, Alien Romulus does take place between the events of Alien and Aliens. The movie itself opens up with a salvage crew flying through the wreckage of the Nostromo from Alien 1. They end up discovering a giant cocoon containing what we will soon discover later on in the film to be Big Chap. That is the nickname for the alien in Alien 1 that Ripley blew out of the airlock from the shuttle from the Nostromo. We're then introduced to the colony, Jackson Star, where we meet our protagonist, Kaylee Spaney, her brother Andy, who is an android, and also her friends Kay, who we find out later on is pregnant, Tyler, who it appears she had a bit of a relationship, Rain did, at some point prior to the events of Alien Romulus, Bjorn and Navarro. On this colony planet, we learn a bit about how these colony planets work. We didn't see this in much detail in Aliens. If you've watched the director's cut of James Cameron's Aliens, we did get a brief glimpse of that in the additional footage at the beginning of the director's cut version, but this is the first time within an Alien franchise story that we actually get to see how kind of a working colony under Weyland-Yutani actually operates. And I'll say now, Kaylee Spaney is a young actress that I'm a big fan of. She was originally in the second Pacific Rim film, Uprising. That was the first time that we were introduced to her. I believe it was one of her first films a few years back. And I really enjoyed her in that. Since then, she was in the more recent Civil War movie. And now, of course, I believe she played Priscilla Presley in another film regarding Elvis that I did not see. But I really like her as an actress, and she shines. This is probably my favorite performance of the ones that I've mentioned. And it's clear from the introduction of the character that she is longing to leave this dark world that they're on where the sun never shines to go to another planet. She's a part of this mining colony where most of the parents have died off because of the horrible working conditions under Weyland-Yutani. She believes that she's gone and completed all of her necessary required hours, and now she can be allowed to leave the planet, only to have those hopes and dreams dashed when it turns out that Weyland-Yutani is requiring almost double, if not even triple, the amount of hours before they get their work release. She wants to leave for another world and a better life with her brother, doing that thing with my fingers, Andy, who, again, we discover fairly early on is an android. The Andy character is absolutely fantastic. He's one of the highlights of the film among the actors and actresses in this movie, right alongside of Kaylee Spaney's Rain character. At one point in the film, being an android, he ends up having basically his programming swapped out for another android on the Romulus space station in order to help facilitate getting around the ship and its security measures, which is why he's brought on board in the first place. I'm jumping a bit ahead of myself. But the actor does a fantastic job of sort of playing these two different characters. One being Andy is a very likable, awkward android who has a very specific way of speaking and whose prime directive is to make sure that he protects his sister, Rain, being Kaylee Spaney. When he takes on the other character, he becomes more of a straightforward Weyland-Yutani android, with the prime directive being what's best for the corporation. So her friends, after finding out she's not going to be allowed to leave, they themselves wanting to leave, they discover that there is what I believe in the film they first thought was just a derelict spaceship, and it turns out to be a space station that happens to be passing above Jackson Star, the planet colony. They had come to find out that it actually is a derelict space station. But the friends convince Rain to fly with them in their mining vessel, the Corbijn 4, to the derelict space station, passing overhead in hopes of retrieving cryotubes so that they can make the 9-year journey to that other planet that Rain was planning on going to. They need to have her come along, not for Rain, but because Andy, being a Weyland-Yutani android, could potentially go and open up the doors to the ship. And again, this is why they have to eventually end up swapping out the programming chip so that he is able to facilitate within the security confines of the Romulus space station. The Romulus space station itself is locked into a decaying orbit above the planet as it was passing by, and we're told that it has 36 hours until it eventually will crash into the ice rings orbiting the colony planet that they are attempting to escape from. And in doing so, the ship will be destroyed. I'll say up front, this movie is wholly Aliens in that original trilogy Aliens vibe. From the aesthetics, the design work. There's even, at the beginning of the film in Jackson Star on the colony planet, You can even see a sign that says bar that is directly the same type of neon graphic that is used when they arrive at the mining colony, the atmosphere colony, mining colony on in Aliens. The analog nature of the way the computer systems operate, straight from Alien and Aliens. Also, the Alien Isolation game, which I quite enjoyed playing as well. So in the first portion of this film, you really are getting fully into the Alien vibe, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Upon arrival on the Romulus space station, they end up finding an older, dismantled and wrecked. You can clearly see that there had been some alien mayhem taking place with the burns through multiple levels of the station, and they find this android that is the same model as Ash from Alien 1 named Rook. Now, this is the one part of the film that I've heard most people having complaints about, and even I was taken aback bit in the beginning, but I ended up getting used to it. Rook, who again is this same type of android that we saw in Ash in the original Alien, will serve as the narrator throughout the remainder of our story. Either them being in the same room as he is sort of giving the backstory and the details of what is actually happening on the Romulus space station, or through video monitors as the movie kind of kicks into overdrive and he's kind of playing in the background, directing these characters while he has certainly his own intentions of what he wants to see happen relating to protecting the alien species at all costs. And here's where I do agree with some of the criticism. They end up doing what I can only believe is deepfake relating to recreating the actor who originally played Ash to make him look younger, sort of de-aging him. But it clearly looks more of the what they call uncanny valley deepfake than it does certainly what we've seen recently of other de-aging of actors before. There's just something that's off about it. You can forgive it a little bit considering that we're seeing a very wrecked, only torso and head and arms of this android. I feel, though, and I would love to hear what the director had to say relating to why they decided to go this particular direction to de-age this actor. Why? I understand why they used Ash from the original Alien. It makes sense that there would be another duplicate android to look like him as well, but you could have gotten away with that by simply choosing a different actor altogether. Now, because of the prominence and the amount of screen time that Rook, this narrator android, for lack of a better way to describe him, has in the film, you end up becoming accustomed to what he looks like. Being so familiar with the original Alien and Ash from the original Alien, again, it takes me out a little bit. When I saw it, I was kind of like, whoa, they didn't pull that off very well. But as the movie continues, it didn't bother me nearly as much. So as we started to learn at the beginning of the film, when the giant cocoon containing the original alien from Alien 1 was brought aboard this ship is a research vessel for Weyland-Yutani where they are doing alien experiments. We're quickly introduced to a host of facehuggers that are in stasis, which begin to wreak havoc upon our characters having arrived from the planet below. Eventually, one of the facehuggers infecting Navarro, who was essentially the pilot of the Corbijn. And I will say that the ship design, fantastic. I love my spaceships. When the Corbijn took off from Jackson Star, the way that they conducted the liftoff from the planet, I think we're looking at, 2142 is the year. For example, in my EMBARK stories, which I will talk about at the end of this for a very specific reason, takes place in 2172. It does this vertical liftoff that's rather violent and cool. They spend a lot of time with the ship and it taking off into space, and then you get some beautiful orbital shots of the planet as it's arriving at the Romulus space station. I mean, the movie just looks spectacular. I went into this film very much expecting something that was going to be incredibly pared back from what we had seen before in the Alien franchise. If you've seen the movie Prey, which was the most recent Predator film that took place hundreds of years before the events of the other films, with a tribe of natives going up against a predator. That film was, incredibly pared back and simple, straightforward, much along the same lines as the original Alien, where the other Predator movies tended to be a lot more detailed, a lot more expansive. I was expecting that Alien Romulus was going to be something more akin to that and the original Alien, where we would be dealing with a singular alien that they would be tracking. This movie didn't do that at all. It was much wider in scope, even though we were essentially only visiting two different locales, the Jackson Star Colony and, of course, the Romulus space station. Now, within that, you have various set pieces on the station, whether it's the Corbijn, which ends up inside back the space station. I'll talk about that here in just a moment. Whether or not it's the hive colony inside the ship, the different portions of the space station. It's expansive in its locale and rich in terms of lore, which is something I also wasn't expecting either. So we have Navarro infected with the facehugger. They end up getting the facehugger off of her, not knowing whether or not she has actually been infected. We soon learn that she has. This leads to a series of circumstances in which Kay, who was the pregnant one of the group, and Navarro end up detaching from the space station as she begins to give birth through her chest in one of the most amazing chestburster sequences using this light X-ray. And it was actually shown in the trailer where you can actually put it against your skin and you can see through. Almost as if you would go and take a light and you put it under your hand. You can see it sort of shine through. How it's translucent. This does an actual X-ray, and you get to see this amazing shot, and you look closely enough, you can see the baby xenomorph actually biting through her ribcage. I'm not one that typically gets into a lot of gore and horror movies, but for an Alien franchise to see that happen, it was pretty awesome. And the birthing scene in and of itself was as horrific as you would expect. Through that birthing scene of the alien on the ship, which ends up sort of being the main alien, the Corbijn is detached and ends up crashing back into the landing bay of the Romulus space station, which subsequently, because of a series of explosions that takes place during this entire sequence, the Romulus is set off of its current course and on a path to crash into the ice ring around the planet in about an hour or so versus the 36 hours that they were expecting, and now the clock is ticking. So now we've got a xenomorph on the loose, and we end up seeing this new phase of its life cycle, where at one point, Flynn and I believe, who was it in the hallway? I think it was Flynn and Kay? Flynn and Kay end up coming across the newly birthed xenomorph, but he's now created a cocoon up in the corner ceiling of one of the corridors in which he is about to emerge from. They have these shock sticks, which were, I believe, originally seen in the Alien Isolation video game. At one point, he shoves it in to this very biologically... Well, how do I want to word it? H.R. Geiger, who designed the original Alien, was very big into the female anatomy. And the whole sort of undertone of the original Alien was this idea of what if men had to go and give birth, right? It's just sort of this fear that's sort of subconsciously embedded, right? And there's a lot of, let's be honest, a lot of just sexual references in terms of the visual storytelling within the Alien films. This one takes advantage of that as well, and they keep with that. They're not one-to-one connections at all, but clearly the inspiration is there, and it's there in this cocoon that's sitting up there in the corner of this corridor. Reminded me actually quite a bit, if you've seen the movie, what is the name? Species, which is basically kind of an Alien ripoff. If you've seen the movie Species, it's very similar to the life cycle that alien goes through as a young child before they go into a cocoon, and then they end up coming out as a grown woman who can end up morphing herself into an alien. At one point, he shoves the shock stick into the cocoon, which ends up causing some bleeding, and unfortunately, Flynn meets a horrible demise as the acid for blood ends up dripping on him and eventually killing him. So now we've got the larger xenomorph on the loose, but we come later on in the film to discover, and I was completely not expecting this, that there are many xenomorphs on this space station living in a hive, much like in Aliens. You end up seeing later on in the film empty canisters that were holding the face huggers, and you begin to realize that the big chap that they extracted, the original alien, wreaked havoc on the Romulus and did essentially what happened in Aliens in taking all of the colonists in Aliens. They took all the crew members and ended up cocooning them and then turning them into aliens. So we have a very similar thing that's taking place in Alien Romulus that we also had in Aliens. We then discover that Weyland-Yutani has a version of the black goo from Prometheus. My understanding watching the film is that it wasn't the black goo, and if you're familiar with Prometheus and Covenant, you know what I'm talking about. This was the goo that they used in Prometheus that ended up causing all of the genetic changes to anybody and anything that comes in contact with it. I mean, it was the whole core of the film, which eventually leads to a proto-xenomorph at the end of the original, or the end of Prometheus. My understanding, watching this film one time and not doing any further research before I did this podcast, I apologize, was that Weyland-Yutani was able to extract this material from the big chap original alien. But they do directly reference the black goo as something that Weyland-Yutani was using to try and enhance human biology, partly to give humans the ability to regenerate and heal themselves. Although it's alluded to in some of the visuals that we see in the science lab in Alien Romulus, that it's proven to have disastrous results. And this is when we begin to see not only nods going back to Prometheus and Covenant, David doing his own tests on the black goo and human anatomy to bring about creating the alien in and of itself. What I don't know yet is that this story we know has direct connections to all the other films. It's canon. In Alien Covenant, we are led to believe that David ends up creating a version of the alien. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be the alien, because we do see a mural of the alien in Prometheus. My sort of takeaway is that David was attempting to create a better version of your typical alien, and we end up getting a version of that at the end of Covenant. We sort of get your very, standard, the one alien that everybody recognizes with a few differences at the end of Covenant. This alien and these aliens that we end up seeing in Alien Romulus look to be one-to-one to the big chap alien from the original Alien film. I wonder how many times I say the word alien on this podcast. Would make an interesting drinking game. Probably could do some damage to some people if they made it to the end before they passed out. Weyland-Yutani is using this black goo to enhance human biology. This is definitely going to come into play later in the movie. So now our protagonists, Rain, Tyler, and Andy, are on a mission to rescue Kay, taken captive by the alien Navarro. Also, I want to mention that Andy, again, has to go and switch out his programming. So now he's working on basically behalf of Weyland-Yutani and the company and not watching after Rain, which was his original prime directive until they switched out the disc in his neck. This causes problems as they're trying to go and rescue Kay, as Andy is now making decisions that aren't best for his friends, which results in Kay being taken captive from the alien, as opposed to going and making sure that he can protect Rain throughout this entire ordeal. They eventually do reach Kay in the hive and rescue her for her cocoon, but she's injured at this point in time. Kay begins to head back to the Corbijn, while Rain at one point goes back for an injured Andy. So let me stop here for just a little bit, because I know that in terms of the order of the way things are happening, it's a little off. Tyler is still alive at this point. Navarro and Floyd are dead at this point. We lose Tyler shortly, right around this portion of the film. There's a moment, though, when they're all together. Kay, who's pregnant, is injured. They're having difficulty getting her back to the ship because of her injuries. Andy, who's working in the best interest of the corporation, ends up bringing a container filled with the black goo because he's trying to save the scientific research for Weyland-Yutani. He explains that, listen, if you inject this goo into her, perhaps it'll go and regenerate the parts of her body that are injured. There's a debate that takes place, and they decide not to for the risk of not knowing what's going to happen. However, this is where the group gets split up. Kay gets heading back to the Corbijn, while Rain goes after Andy, still in Weyland-Yutani programming mode, who's back by where the hive is. Now, because Kay is injured, she decides that she can't get back to the ship unless she goes and injects herself with the black goo to heal herself, in which she does that very thing, which we all know is going to end with disastrous results. She finally throws caution to the wind and gives herself the black goo. So now we've got Kay heading back to the Corbijn. We've got Rain and Andy with his original programming after Rain ends up finding him. They're the only ones left. Now, at this point, we end up with this amazing battle taking place within the hive that we find on the Romulus space station, and I'll get to more of this in a moment. Kay ends up giving birth to an alien-human hybrid. Kay ends up being killed by it after it comes back and essentially is looking at her like it's her mom. She's eventually killed by the alien, and we end up with this final battle between the hybrid and Rain as the space station Romulus is crashing into the rings of the planet. She's able to get loose in the Corbijn and eventually emerges victorious after she goes one-on-one with the hybrid alien inside of the cargo hold that's detachable from the actual Corbijn ship, and ends up having the hybrid alien blasted into space after she knocks over the egg at which it emerged from that had a bunch of acid in it. We get to the end of the film, and we end up with a very typical alien ending. She puts Andy into cryosleep. She goes into cryosleep as we see the Corbijn heading off to what we believe is the planet that she originally wanted to go to, saying that she is Rain, the last survivor of the Corbijn, in typical fashion of what we've seen happen within the other Alien films. Certainly saw that in Alien. Something similar without the voiceover in Aliens. We did see that happen, and that same sort of voiceover at the end of Alien Prometheus. So that pretty much sums up the movie. All right, so let's get into what I liked, what I didn't like, and some further thoughts on this film. This movie does multiple things. It's a sequel to the original Alien. It's a prequel to Aliens, while also being a soft reboot of the entire franchise and a sidebar story that could lead to its own series of spin-offs. I was listening to an Alien podcast I think it was called Perfect Organism. And there's a group of 4 or 5 people that had just come out from seeing the film. Huge Alien franchise fans, more so than I am. They take in all of the ancillary Alien content, the books, the comic books, and they had a lot of complaints over how derivative the film could be and some of the decisions that they made, and even complaining that the film didn't go new places, which I kind of disagree. It does at times play as a greatest hits to other films. I do agree it is slightly derivative in terms of story beats, but I certainly didn't mind it at all. It was very much on par with what we've seen of these companies, these movie studios, who are trying to either continue franchises or revamp franchises. And I'm going to make other comparisons. I'll just do it now. It has a lot in common with The Force Awakens. The Force Awakens played a bit like a greatest hits of the original trilogy. You end up on planets, a series of planets, snow, forest, and desert. When you go through the original trilogy, they're all there. You've got similar beats in terms of characters, decisions that are being made as well, in an attempt to do a slight reboot while not being a reboot, but being able to branch out and tell further stories. Again, I don't mind that. And in the world that we live in right now, the hardcore fans are in the minority to the masses, and clearly the studio wants this film to appear to the masses. So again, being a sequel, a prequel, a soft reboot, and its own sidebar story, I think it works in all of those fashions. If you were to watch, and I think this is what some of the hardcore fans were looking for, because I listened to another podcast afterwards that was just a movie review podcast, and they absolutely loved this film. What the Alien podcast commentators were saying was that if you were to watch these films in order, it makes sense, but you're kind of seeing the same thing over and over again when you go from Alien to Alien Romulus and then to Aliens. And I can certainly see that. I don't think it was necessarily designed to do that. Most people don't watch films that way. It's weirdos like me, and probably you because you're listening to this podcast, that do that. I like to watch things in sequential order. But I think when this film was made, the desire was to do exactly what I said. Keep this franchise alive. And in doing so, they combined so many different elements from other films that you now have in one movie the mythology from all the other films that came before it that you can now continue on and move away from what happened in Aliens. I don't see another film following Alien Romulus to be connected to aliens in any way. This is just an alien story that happened to take place in this particular timeline that has references to those other movies, but aren't tying into them directly, going from Romulus to Aliens. It adds credibility to a weaker film such as Resurrection, and even fixes issues that I personally had with that film. And I'll get to that. I'll get to that a little bit later on. It feels wholly like an Alien movie, as I mentioned earlier. And interestingly, the Alien prequels are to the original Alien films what the Star Wars prequels are to the original trilogy, where you have this, these decades that separate the originals from the prequels. Less so with the Star Wars movies, but you know what I'm saying. When you go and watch the prequels, they justify the look of those movies as being sort of the height of the Republic within Star Wars. And so therefore you've got shinier, high-tech digital technology, whereas when we get into the original trilogy and then later on into the sequel trilogy in Star Wars, you have an oppressive empire that's sort of stifling innovation. You have a ragtag group of individuals using makeshift equipment to push back against the Empire. That's how they justify it. It's justified less so in the Alien movies, because you go back and you watch Covenant and you watch Prometheus, and you would think that these were all films that take place much further away from the originals, even though they took place long before those. The explanation within those films is that Weyland-Yutani is what you're seeing in those movies, being Prometheus and Covenant, and so therefore the technology that they're flying and using in those films is the best of the best that Weyland-Yutani has to offer. Whereas what we're seeing in Alien is truckers in space using much less expensive analog equipment, and something very similar in Alien, Romulus, and Aliens. I do just find it interesting that it really is more about the technology available to filmmakers than it is about continuity within the storytelling. The first third of Alien Romulus is a great, somewhat slow build-up, at which point I was actually asking myself, we're getting some aliens, right? I knew we were, and I wasn't mad, but I was waiting for the aliens to arrive. I'm like, all right, we got to start going through this process. Somebody's got to get a face hugger on their face, got to get impregnated, and we got to give birth, and it has to grow up, and it's going to have to happen pretty fast because we're getting into this film now. Then, of course, we have the point of contact. We have the birth of the alien, after which the movie just gets into a completely different gear. It takes off, and it doesn't let up. At which point, I wasn't even thinking about the first part of it. And as a matter of fact, I'm very much looking forward to going back and watching it again because of the establishing that they do of and world building leading up to the original the first contact with the facehuggers on the Alien Romulus. It helps you care about these characters a little bit more. You get into these characters, certainly the Rain character, the relationship that she has with her android brother Andy drives the latter part of the film, and at one point when she goes back to rescue him at risk of her own safety, I was almost questioning her motives, like, why are you being an idiot? But then it actually works. It plays out really well, and it's quite heartwarming, and I completely understand why she went and did that. It makes all the sense in the world. Again, I expected a smaller scale, and I got a lot more. This movie was way more detailed, way more into the mythology, and a lot more of a ride than I was expecting. There was a whole bit with the gravity generators where they were clicking on and off when they first arrive, only to turn them on for the majority of the film, and then use that trope later on in the movie in the hive attack, which was one of my favorite parts of the film. When Rain goes back to rescue Andy, having changed his programming, she's just outside the hive, and we've learned that there are a lot of aliens, a lot of xenomorphs on this ship, and she has to go and take them out if she's going to be able to get back to the ship and get off of the Romulus space station before it crashes into the ice ring. And we now have another moment in the film that calls back to, this time, Aliens, and again, the director's cut of Aliens. In the director's cut of Aliens, there is a sequence in which they put up remote guns in the hallways that they've welded off to take out the aliens. And it's basically wave after wave of xenomorphs that keep getting taken out by these guns until they end up running out of ammo. In this case, we have Rain with a pulse rifle and only so many shots that she has to use to take out these aliens. The concern over them bleeding through the ship and decompressing the Romulus space station is solved by turning off the gravity generator. In which case, once she's done wiping out all the aliens, we get this awesome bit of then dodging the alien acid blood in zero gravity, which was just a lot of fun and an incredibly unique sequence. You can see a bit of this in the trailer. We have an amazing elevator scene with what I believe was the Navarro birthed alien. It's where we end up getting the close shot of the xenomorph right up against Rain's face. It's sort of screaming at her right before it's about to take her out. There was a moment when the alien actually rescues her. She's about to fall down the elevator shaft, and the tail grabs her and then sets her on the ladder. And at first I was taken aback, and then I slowly realized, I go, oh, wait. He's saving her because he wants her to be able to go and give birth to another alien. That's why he's saving her. Andy ends up coming in, saving the day in this moment. A lot of this had to do with the zero gravity play as it was getting ready to turn back on again, and they were using the zero G to get up the elevator shaft. This is the one complaint that I have next to the uncanny valley of the Ash Rook android looking too CGI, looking too deepfake. When Andy finally comes in and saves the day and takes out that alien, he ends up saying the "get away from her, you bitch" line. He delivers it differently, but there was a moment when he says, "get away from her," after he takes the xenomorph out. He pauses, and then he says, "you bitch." I get it. I don't think that it was needed. It was one of the biggest complaints that other show had. Didn't take me out of the film, but it did have me kind of scratching my head of whether or not that line that Sigourney Weaver, Ripley's character in Aliens, delivers, that is so famous in the original Aliens, if that line is worthy to be repeated in the same way you would have lines repeated like in Star Wars with the "I have a bad feeling about this," right? That's in every single film, but it's something that naturally people would say. "Get away from her, you bitch." So that was a bit clunky. Really, a bigger complaint than what I had about the deep-faked android, but not enough to ruin the film by any stretch at all, just a slight eye roll. When we get to the end of the movie, this is where I probably had the most difficulty until I sort of let the movie kind of wash over me and realize that what came before all this makes it make all the sense in the world. So let me start by saying the biggest issue that I had with Alien Resurrection was, first off, and I know it's weird, the opening credits in Alien Resurrection were just strange. They tapped this French director that was most known for a rather famous French film called Amélie. They wanted a director that was going to do something unique with Alien. That was their whole decision in the first place, why they had gone with David Fincher for Alien 3, why they had gone with James Cameron for Alien 2. Because they brought in Ridley Scott for the original Alien, who had not done much of anything leading up to that. The backstory on that, by the way, with Ridley Scott is that he was depressed for like 3 months after seeing Star Wars for the first time because it was so good he wished he had made it. He had been given the script for Alien and turned it away, and then decided after the success of Star Wars, the studio greenlit it and he decided to direct it. But the guys that were in charge of the franchise itself and writing the stories, they wanted to continue this tradition of bringing on these new hotshot directors. So they succeeded with James Cameron in Aliens, didn't succeed nearly as much with David Fincher in Alien 3, so much so that he completely disowned that film after the studio went and chopped it up, which is why the director's cut of Alien 3 is so much better. So when you get to Alien Resurrection, they bring in this French director hot off of this rather popular French film called Amélie. He opens the film up with this weird close-up, distorted shots of what we would find out later on would be the failed cloning attempts of Ripley in that movie. So the whole opening credits of Alien Resurrection, they're just kind of gross. They don't work for me. When you get into Alien Resurrection, in which they bring Ripley back to life, because, spoiler alert, she ends up dying in Alien 3, Using her blood, they end up cloning her, and ultimately they do that because they want to bring the alien out of her chest because she was impregnated in Alien 3 from the beginning of that film. And it turns out in Alien Resurrection, she actually had a queen in her. There were a bunch of failed experiments, and at one point in Alien Resurrection, you wind up in this laboratory with all these really gross, disgusting, completely distorted, exaggerated versions of these cloned Ripleys, and you find one that's like half alive, and they have to burn her to put her out of her misery. It's all very weird and strange. At the end of the film, Ripley ends up essentially mating with the queen alien, and they end up having this alien hybrid at the end of Alien Resurrection. The flesh-colored xenomorph just didn't work for me at the end of Alien Resurrection. I thought it was creepy, I thought it was weird, and it was just a part of that film that I truly enjoy, because it is a lot of fun. The characters in it are good, there's a lot of great xenomorph action sequences in it, but the ending just really threw me off. When we get to the end of Alien Romulus, and Kay ends up giving birth to this hybrid, because of the black goo that she injected, it ended up having not only an effect on her, which you find out after she gives birth, but it ended up creating this xenomorph human hybrid. It was really creepy. When it comes out of her womb, you can actually see a baby face. It quickly begins to grow, and you actually see this hybrid growing on screen, which I did enjoy. I liked seeing sort of the life cycle and the metamorphosis of how quickly this alien would begin to grow, because the other aliens grow rather quickly. The design work on the hybrid in Alien Romulus I thought was a lot better than what they did in Resurrection, but now that we know what came before in Prometheus, and in Prometheus we really only got sort of your typical xenomorph, and it really wasn't even a typical xenomorph, right at the end, closing shot before they go to credits. The rest of the film had just a lot of very different, more snake-like, less mechanical, right, looking aliens in that. Similar in Covenant, although we end up with your typical xenomorph in Covenant. We do have some aliens at the beginning of that film that have a different texture than what we're used to seeing. So because of what came before it, knowing what the black goo does and being more accustomed to this part of the xenomorph life cycle, it made it make total sense, made me appreciate Resurrection more to the point where I want to go back and watch it this weekend, and made it more highly effective. That hybrid alien was really creepy and weird, and you just wanted to see it killed. And so the final standoff between it and Rain, I thought, was very effective. If we hadn't received so much xenomorph action and appearances earlier in the film, and the focus would have been on this hybrid one at the end, I might have been left disappointed, but I felt like they gave it just enough creepy scream time to be that typical sort of fourth act that an alien movie does, and I thought it was very, very effective from that. This is what the Alien franchise has turned into. When I got into it, initially we just thought of these xenomorphs, and Ridley Scott went back and in Prometheus has showed us that no, this is actually a much more complicated, deeper mythology with a lot of available options in terms of different types of aliens, all keeping within the same thought process, that whatever the alien genes, for the lack of describing it a better way or having a better way to describe it, whatever they come in contact with, it ends up mimicking that particular organism. So in Alien 3, initially it ends up in the movie version, the theatrical release version, the alien, the facehugger ends up impregnating a dog, and that becomes the main alien. In the director's cut, it actually ends up impregnating an ox, which it takes on a different look. And even the dog one in the theatrical cut took on a different look as well. So again, just sort of keeping with the theme of what the alien species in and of itself can do, it made a lot of sense. I hope that they continue with these stories. Again, the actress Kaylee Spaney is really enjoyable to watch on screen. She's not a Ripley clone by any stretch. She's her own character and motivations, and has her own character and motivations. There are some similarities, especially the reluctance that Ripley has in Aliens to go on the mission to LV-426 with the Colonial Marines. You know, it's only after the nightmares that she decided to go. In this, very similar. Rain has a lot of reluctance going and trying to do this mission, if you will, on the Romulus space station, and even hangs back on the Corbijn until everything begins to go haywire. Does she then go into the actual Romulus space station? So there's a lot of places where this can go now. We know the Black Goo is on board. This could be essentially the only access that Weyland-Yutani has to this particular, bioweapon material. So you can certainly see a story where Weyland-Yutani ends up grabbing the shuttle, much in the same way that happens with Aliens, and we're off on another adventure. I'm still hoping that we end up getting that final Ridley Scott film that will close the gap between the prequels of Covenant to the original Alien movie. Ridley Scott said that he was going to make it, whereas at the end of Covenant, you have David going off through space. I believe he's heading to the original colony planet with all the embryos and the facehugger embryos and all the people on board, which you assume he's going to end up creating a bunch of aliens. I'm hoping that we finally get that last film to connect to the original Alien. I also know that there is a television show that's being worked on as well. I don't know where the time frame of the television show comes in relating to the entire timeline of the Alien franchise. But maybe I'll do a subsequent podcast and try to go and find that out. Ultimately, I really love this film. And my wife did too. She's kind of just a casual fan of Alien. She doesn't go back and watch any of those movies like I do. I rewatch them all the time. And she really enjoyed it to the point where we were having multiple conversations about the movie even today when I got home from work. I'm really looking forward to going back out into the theater to see it. So before I wrap up the podcast, I do want to mention one thing which I thought was kind of funny. And I've had this happen a couple of times. I've written a series of science fiction books. It's one series called EMBARK. 7 books in all in the series. The first book, EMBARK Book 1, starts off on Earth in the year 2172, in which an industrial catastrophe sparks an apocalyptic chain of events. I have a group of 5 young people who end up setting off on an adventure and are unwittingly thrust into humanity's fight for survival and a battle against a corporate entity who tries to take advantage of the global evacuation and gain control. This turns into a space opera that spreads out across all 7 of my books, available on Amazon.com, and I'll do my little spiel here about my books. I hope you'll go and take a look at them. However, oftentimes I watch these movies and I find that there's a bunch of similarities to my books. And it's all just merely coincidental. But once again, I've had this happen with, it happened with Independence Day Resurgence. More specifically with one of the most recent Fast and Furious films. Like, it had like a whole bunch of story beats that were very similar to my books. This movie, though, I thought was rather interesting. So, in Book 2 of the series, Treasure in Darkness, it, just like Alien Romulus, opens up with a salvage crew in space looking through the wreckage of spacecraft. You have the mining colony in Alien Romulus on Jackson Star made up of mostly teens and young adults whose parents had passed away. In my Book 1 of EMBARK, You have the parents that are off working for the two major global corporations, D Corp and Entercon, and the teen and young adults are pretty much set off by themselves. And eventually, in the middle of the global evacuation, they are separated altogether. The entire concept of the Romulus space station and its exploration is very similar to events that take place in the middle of Book 2, Treasure and Darkness, in my EMBARK series, and one of my large vessels that I call Massive Mobile Warehouses, MMWs, that's found abandoned. In that same book, I have a space dogfight utilizing the rings of a planet to a similar effect, meaning if the spacecraft end up hitting the rings, they're going to be damaged by the ice particles. And I have an entire sequence in Treasure and Darkness that plays with zero gravity in a very similar fashion in terms of using it to get an advantage against an enemy by turning off the gravity generator. I doubt at all that the writers or Fede Alvarez even are aware that I write science fiction books. I just thought it was funny, and it makes me like this movie even more because I get to see sort of real movie realizations of what I had envisioned in my science fiction novels. So I guess at the end of the day, I kind of go, you know what? They're good ideas, and they're such good ideas that they inadvertently ended up in this other film that I enjoy. So I hope you'll head on over to Amazon.com and check out my science fiction space opera series. I'll give you the description of book 1 in the series. While Earth faces its end, the fight to rule the stars begins. When Taft Guardia agrees to help fellow hotshot starfighter pilot Keith Amaro investigate a cryptic message from her late aerospace engineer father, they embark on a mission to uncover the truth behind her father's mysterious death and a looming planet-wide industrial catastrophe. With rival megacorporations D Corp and Entercon on the brink of war during the global evacuation, Taft and Keitha must race to uncover the key to saving humanity and each other from annihilation before it's too late. Listen, I hope you'll take a moment and check out the books. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction. They're written for adults, but in terms of content, they're completely appropriate for ages 11 plus. Head on out and, pick up book 1 today. They're available in ebook, Kindle Unlimited, hardcover, paperback, audiobook. If you like your science fiction space opera to be filled with some really cool technology, the stories to be epic, some romance, and a lot of action, EMBARK is perfect for you. So yeah, Alien Romulus. Man, I want to go see it again right now. I should have kept my tickets. I had tickets to go again today. Well, I had tickets to go Thursday, and then I thought I couldn't go Thursday, so I bought tickets for Friday, but I ended up seeing it Thursday, and I canceled my Friday tickets. I kind of wish I hadn't. I want to go see it again. Maybe I convinced one of my sons to go see it with me. Hey, thanks for checking out the podcast. Take a look at my books. I'd really appreciate it. Amazon.com, EMBARK, John, J-O-N, Justice. And drop me an email. What did you think of Alien Romulus? Did you like it as much as I did? I'd love to hear from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening. I hope wherever you are and wherever you're listening, you're happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. God bless, and thank you so much for spending time with the podcast. Bye.